"You do not belong here." Emily delivered the words with the crisp precision of a stage actor, ensuring every syllable carried perfectly across the living room. At 39, my daughter-in-law had mastered the lucrative art of packaging public humiliation as authentic lifestyle content. She stood bathed in the blinding glare of a towering ring light, wearing a wireless lavalier microphone clipped to her white silk blouse. As a retired stage sound engineer, I had spent 40 years mixing audio and hunting for dead spots in crowded theaters, so I knew exactly how sound traveled. Her voice was perfectly pitched, loud enough to bounce off the restored mahogany walls, and it killed every other conversation instantly. The soft clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped. The low murmur of 50 wealthy investors vanished. A heavy scent of catered roasted garlic and expensive eucalyptus arrangements suddenly thickened the air, catching sharply in the back of my throat. I stood near the edge of an imported Persian rug, feeling the solid oak floorboards press up against the soles of my work boots. Those were the exact same oak boards I had purchased, sanded, and installed using my own retirement savings. I am 69 years old, and in all my decades on this earth, I had never been dismissed so efficiently. "This evening is for our sponsors, Raymond," Emily continued, smiling at the camera lens on her tripod before shifting her gaze back to me. "We are celebrating the future of the brand, and this is a closed set." My son, Evan, stood exactly 2 steps behind his wife. A custom navy suit hung perfectly on his shoulders, a tailored garment that probably cost more than my first truck. I watched his throat work as he swallowed hard, and for a fleeting second, I thought the boy I had raised might actually step forward. I waited for him to clear his throat, look at the crowd, and tell everyone the truth. Without my money, this house would still be a rotten shell with a leaking roof. Instead, Evan stared at his polished leather shoes. He shifted his weight from side to side, shoved his hands deep into his pockets, and kept his mouth shut. That silence was the loudest thing I had heard all night. There was absolutely no point in arguing with them in front of a live audience. Raising my voice would only provide my daughter-in-law with dramatic viral footage for her next upload, and she thrived on that kind of chaos, always twisting every disagreement into a brave narrative about protecting her peace. I refused to become her content. Turning my back on the flashing lenses and the collective stare of the guests, I walked away. My boots made heavy, deliberate thuds against the wood as I moved down the long corridor toward the back of the house. A gleaming brass plaque mounted on the hallway wall caught the overhead light, bearing the words, "The Cole Forever Home," etched in elegant cursive. It was a beautiful, expensive lie, stamped in metal. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut behind me, instantly muting the party chatter. The air in here smelled sharply of fresh paint and lemon polish, a chemical mixture that entirely masked the old, comforting scent of pine and lavender that used to linger when my Aunt Irene lived in this house. I walked straight to the built-in cabinet tucked into the far corner of the room. Emily and Evan operated under the assumption that they controlled every square inch of this property, completely forgetting who had actually framed these walls and built these shelves. They had also forgotten that Irene gave me a small brass key 3 years ago, long before they convinced the extended family she needed to be moved into an assisted living facility. I pulled that key from my jacket pocket, noting how warm the metal felt against my palm, and slid it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a sharp, satisfying snap that seemed unusually loud in the empty room. Reaching into the dark shadows of the bottom shelf, my fingers brushed the frayed edges of a dark brown leather folder. The material felt heavy, cold, and rigid as I pulled it out into the light. This was not merely a collection of old appliance receipts or forgotten warranty papers. The thick envelope held the original, certified recorded deed, along with a stack of signed documents that proved exactly who owned the ground beneath this renovated fortress. Without this folder, their highly publicized handover ceremony was nothing more than an elaborate piece of theater. With the leather secured firmly under my arm, I bypassed the coat rack entirely, leaving my wool scarf behind. I pushed through the back door, and a sudden rush of cool, damp Portland air hit my face. The gravel crunched loudly under my boots as I walked down the narrow alleyway, leaving the glowing windows, the soft jazz, and the shadows of the party guests far behind me. The streetlights hummed a low electric tune overhead, casting long yellow shadows across the wet pavement. I kept a steady pace, focusing entirely on the rhythm of my own breathing, and I did not look back at the house even once. 4 blocks down the street, my phone vibrated violently against my ribs. The screen lit up the darkness, flashing Evan's name in bright white letters. He rarely called me directly anymore, usually preferring to send brief text messages whenever he needed a leaky pipe fixed or an emergency transfer to cover his credit card bills. I stopped under a flickering street lamp and let the phone ring 3 times, feeling the vibration buzz against my palm, before I finally slid my thumb across the screen and lifted the device to my ear. "Dad," the word came out thin, fragile, and almost panicked. Evan was inhaling sharply, breathing entirely too fast for someone calling to offer an apology. "Speak," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "I just went into the study to get the sponsor contracts." A heavy, dreadful pause followed his admission. I could hear the faint, pulsing bass of the party music echoing in the background on his end of the line, but he lowered his voice to a frantic whisper. "Dad, the cabinet is open." I remained silent, letting him drown in the quiet of the city street. The pavement felt hard and unforgiving under my feet, a sharp contrast to the plush, imported rugs in Emily's curated living room. "Dad, please," Evan whispered, his voice finally cracking with genuine fear. "What did you take?" He did not ask why I had left the party abruptly. There were no questions about whether I was hurt by the public humiliation, or if I was driving home safely in the dark, or how I felt about being erased from the history of the house I helped build. Only the missing papers mattered to him. Evan knew exactly what was supposed to be inside that locked cabinet, and he understood perfectly what its absence meant for his flawless, sponsored brand. Looking down at the worn leather pressed against my side, I realized that for 40 years, my only job as a father was to protect my son from the consequences of his own choices. Paying his debts, fixing his careless mistakes, and shielding him from failure had cost me almost everything I had to give. I had stood quietly in the background, holding the tools and writing the checks, while he built a completely fabricated life on top of my real labor. My thumb found the red button on the screen. The call disconnected instantly, cutting off his panicked breathing mid-sentence. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, adjusted my grip on the heavy folder, and continued walking into the dark. The time for protecting Evan was officially over. The waiting room of the law office smelled strongly of stale coffee and expensive floor wax. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, staring down at the dark brown folder resting on my knees. Sunlight cut through the horizontal blinds, warming the worn edges of the leather. My phone vibrated deep in my jacket pocket for the 11th time since sunrise. I did not need to pull it out to know who was calling. Evan had been leaving frantic voicemails all night, begging me to pick up the phone, demanding to know what I had taken from the locked study. I ignored the buzzing and focused on the steady ticking of the wall clock. A heavy oak door opened, and David stepped into the reception area. He was a seasoned real estate attorney I had met a decade ago, a careful, methodical man who spoke slowly and billed by the minute. He wore a crisp blue shirt, looking far more awake than I felt. "Come on back, Ray," the attorney said, holding the door open. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I have had better nights," I replied, following him into the spacious office. Taking a seat across from his massive wooden desk, I placed the folder on the polished surface between us. The leather felt incredibly heavy leaving my hands. I unspooled the brittle string tie and pushed the flap open, revealing the thick stack of documents inside. A faint scent of dry, aged paper drifted up, and that smell immediately pulled me back, 3 years in time. I could almost see my Aunt Irene sitting at her small kitchen table, sliding this exact envelope toward me. Her hands had been trembling slightly from age, but her eyes were perfectly sharp and clear. She had asked me to keep these records safe, just until her property trust was finalized, because she did not want the paperwork getting lost or accidentally thrown away during the massive house renovation. I promised her I would guard it with my life. I just never expected I would need to guard it from my own son. David put on a pair of silver reading glasses and pulled out the very first document. The thick paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. It was a certified copy of the recorded deed, bearing the official stamp of the county clerk. He scanned the legal description carefully, tracing the dense lines of text with the tip of his pen. "This is the deed for the Portland property," David said, looking up over the rim of his glasses. "The house your daughter-in-law was broadcasting live on the internet last night." "Who owns it?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Irene Walsh," the lawyer replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "Ownership never transferred. Evan and Emily have absolutely zero legal claim to that property. They cannot sell it, they cannot leverage it, and they certainly cannot transfer the title to a corporate sponsor." A tight, painful knot in my chest loosened slightly at his words. The house was safe, but that brief flash of relief was immediately replaced by a sick, sinking feeling in my stomach. The phone in my pocket buzzed again, vibrating relentlessly against my ribs. Evan was still trying to reach me, likely hoping he could talk me into handing over the paperwork before the escrow company noticed any missing signatures on their end. A stubborn part of me, the part that had spent 40 years fixing his broken windows and paying his overdue bills, desperately wanted to answer the call. I wanted my son to confess. I wanted him to apologize, to tell me he was going to stop this foolish, greedy charade on his own without forcing my hand. "So we can stop the handover ceremony," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the desk. "We can prove they are lying to everyone." David sighed heavily. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking at me with a mixture of professional caution and genuine pity. "We can stop the sale, yes," the attorney explained patiently. "This deed proves Irene is the legal owner of the land and the structure, but it does not prove abuse, Ray." I frowned, completely confused by his hesitation. "What do you mean? They are actively trying to sell a house that does not belong to them." "They could easily claim it was a simple misunderstanding," David said, setting his glasses down on the desk. Evan could tell a judge that Irene promised them the house, and he simply thought the transfer paperwork was already finished. He could say he was acting on her behalf, getting the property ready for the market in order to pay for her assisted living care. In a courtroom, simple incompetence is much easier to prove than calculated malice. The harsh truth of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Emily had spent months building a flawless, public narrative. She had thousands of loyal online followers believing she and Evan were a self-made, hard-working couple who had rescued an abandoned family property with their own bare hands. One piece of paper would halt the real estate transaction, but it would not expose the depth of their betrayal. If we only presented the deed, Emily would just spin a brand new story. She would play the victim, claiming she was misled by a confused old woman and a bitter, jealous father-in-law. My phone vibrated one more time, and a text message lit up the screen through the thin fabric of my trousers. I pulled the device out and stared at the glowing words. Evan had typed a single sentence, begging me not to ruin his life. I looked back at the open folder resting on the desk. There were dozens of pages left inside, stacked neatly beneath the deed. Irene had been a meticulous woman, keeping a strict record of every promise ever made to her, and she had trusted me to hold the pieces together. "The deed stops the sale," David said quietly, watching the changing expression on my face. "But if you want to prove your son knew exactly what he was doing when he locked your aunt away, we are going to need a lot more than that. What else is in there?" I set my phone face down on the desk, ignoring the silent screen, and reached for the next stack of papers. My fingers brushed the next thick stack of parchment inside the dark leather folder. David leaned across his massive wooden desk, watching closely as I pulled out a heavy document secured with a blue notary seal. The thick pages felt crisp and stiff, completely different from the soft, aged texture of the property deed we had just reviewed. "Let me see that," the attorney said gently, extending his hand. I slid the papers across the polished mahogany surface, and David adjusted his silver reading glasses. The quiet rustle of turning pages filled the silent office, accompanied by the distant, rhythmic hum of Portland traffic outside the tall window. My phone had finally stopped buzzing in my jacket pocket, leaving a heavy, expectant stillness in its wake. "This is exactly what we needed to find," David said, tapping the center of the second page with his gold pen. "This is a limited power of attorney. Evan convinced your entire family he had universal control over your aunt and her assets. But this document tells a completely different story." My oya tightened instinctively, and my back went rigid against the leather chair. He told everyone Irene gave him full authority when her memory started slipping. He claimed she wanted her to handle everything so she would not have to worry about the daily stress of homeownership. "He lied," the lawyer replied flatly, turning the document around so it faced me. "Look right here, Ray. Read paragraph 4. I leaned forward, squinting at the dense legal text. The print was small, but the words were perfectly clear, typed out in undeniable black ink. She only authorized him to pay her medical bills, manage her property taxes, and hire contractors for basic maintenance, David explained, his voice taking on that sharp, clinical precision lawyers always used when they found a winning argument. There is a specific restriction written right beneath it, a strict no self-dealing clause. Evan is explicitly forbidden from transferring any real estate to himself, his spouse, or any business entity he controls. A cold chill settled at the base of my neck, slowly radiating down my spine. My son had not made a sloppy clerical error, nor had he simply misunderstood an old woman's wishes. Evan had read this exact document, signed his name on the dotted line in front of a notary, and then deliberately chosen to ignore every single boundary Irene had set. He knew he had no legal right to sell that house to a media company, yet he was doing it anyway, wrapping his theft in a shiny online brand. "I can draft a notice of invalid authority right now," David offered, already reaching for his computer keyboard. "We send this to the escrow company, and the entire sale collapses before lunch. They will not be able to close the deal." I stared at the blue notary stamp. The paper seemed to mock me, exposing 40 years of my blind, desperate parenting. I had spent my entire adult life fixing my son's mistakes, paying off his quiet debts, and hoping he would eventually grow into an honest man. "Wait," I told the attorney, pressing my hand flat against the desk to stop him. "Do not send anything yet. I need to go see Irene." An hour later, the sharp smell of industrial floor cleaner and institutional lavender greeted me at the sliding front doors of the assisted living facility. The building was incredibly clean, brightly lit, and entirely devoid of any real warmth. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of daytime television drifting from the open doorways, feeling completely out of place in my heavy work boots. Irene sat in a high wingback chair near the window of her small private room. She wore a soft yellow cardigan, and a knitted quilt rested across her lap. When I walked in, she turned her head, and her pale blue eyes locked onto mine. There was no confusion in her gaze. She looked exactly like the sharp, uncompromising woman who had helped raise me when I was a boy. "You look terrible, Raymond," she said, her voice thin but perfectly steady. "Sit down before you fall over." I pulled a vinyl visitor chair close to her window and sat down heavily. The bright autumn sunlight caught the deep lines around her mouth, highlighting the sheer exhaustion she tried to hide. "I opened the folder," I said quietly, leaning forward so she could hear me over the steady hum of the air conditioner. "I took it to David this morning." Irene nodded slowly, and her weathered hands smoothed the edges of her knitted blanket. She did not seem surprised by the news. "Evan told me I was getting confused. He said I was forgetting to pay the electric bill, and the city was going to take the house away if I did not sign that paper. He had you sign a limited power of attorney," I explained, watching her face carefully for any sign of memory loss. "It only gave him the right to pay your bills and fix the roof." "Did you ever tell him he could sell the property?" "Absolutely not," Irene replied, her tone hardening instantly. The old woman straightened her shoulders, clearly offended by the very idea. "I told him he could manage the checkbook until we set up the living trust. I explicitly told him that house was never going to be his playground. He looked me right in the eye and promised he understood." Hearing the confirmation directly from her lips felt like a physical weight dropping onto my chest, crushing the last remaining sliver of hope I had been clinging to. My son had looked this vulnerable woman in the eye, made a promise, and immediately started plotting with Emily to strip her of everything she owned. The betrayal was so calculated, and so incredibly cold, that I struggled to reconcile it with the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders. "They are trying to sell it, Irene," I admitted, my voice dropping to a rough, broken whisper. "Emily hosted a massive party last night to celebrate the handover. They are turning your home into a sponsored brand deal, and they plan to sign the final papers very soon." Irene stared out the window for a long time. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy with the shared grief of a fractured family. Finally, she turned back to me, her expression completely unreadable, her jaw set in a hard line. "Are you going to stop them?" she asked. "David has the paperwork ready," I promised, reaching out to gently squeeze her frail hand. "He can freeze the title transfer today. We have the proof." I stood up, ready to walk back out to my truck and make the phone call that would effectively end my son's marriage, ruin his public reputation, and strip away his fake wealth. But as I reached the doorway, my boots stopped moving. The heavy burden of fatherhood, that relentless, foolish instinct to protect my child from the fire, flared up one last time inside my chest. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the dark screen. Evan was a liar and a thief, and he had completely humiliated me, but he was still my son. He deserved to hear the truth from my mouth, not from a sterile legal notice delivered by a stranger. If there was even a fraction of a decent man left inside him, I needed to find out today. "Raymond," Irene called out softly from her chair, noticing my hesitation. "What are you waiting for?" "One last conversation," I said, putting the phone back into my pocket, without dialing the lawyer. "I'm going to give him one final chance to tell the truth." The glowing screen of my phone cast a harsh white light across the scarred laminate of my kitchen table. I sat in the dark apartment, letting the bitter taste of black coffee settle on my tongue, and watched my daughter-in-law lie to 200,000 people. Emily stood in the center of the newly renovated kitchen, wearing a soft beige sweater that looked both effortless and incredibly expensive. The marble countertops gleamed directly behind her, reflecting the flawless studio lighting she always carried around for her shoots. Her posture was relaxed, inviting, and completely manufactured. Building our forever home was never just about the bricks and the paint, she said, pressing a hand flat against her chest. Her voice dropped to that intimate, hushed tone she used to make strangers on the internet feel like close friends. Evan and I sacrificed so much to restore this family legacy. We poured our own blood, sweat, and tears into these walls because we wanted a place that truly belongs to us. We wanted to prove that hard work pays off. I stared at the screen, watching her trace a perfectly manicured fingernail along the edge of the kitchen island. I had paid for that exact slab of marble in cash. My knees still ached from laying the subfloor beneath her designer boots, and my savings account was completely empty because I wanted my son to have a solid foundation. Closing the video application abruptly, I cut off her rehearsed speech and pushed the phone away. The quiet of my small living space rushed back in, broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner. The heavy leather folder sat right in front of my coffee mug, exactly where I had placed it after leaving David's law office. The attorney had warned me that the deed and the limited power of attorney were enough to stop the real estate transfer, but they were not enough to prove intentional fraud. He said Evan could easily play the fool in front of a judge, claiming he simply misunderstood a confused old woman and was trying to do what was best for the family. In a courtroom, incompetence was a solid defense against theft. Reaching out, I untied the brittle string of the folder and pulled out the very last stack of documents. The paper felt different from the rest, printed on crisp, modern hospital stationery rather than heavy, aged legal stock. A blue logo sat at the top corner, bearing the name of a prominent geriatric neurology clinic in downtown Portland. My eyes scanned the thick paragraphs of medical terminology, moving past the clinical jargon until I found the final summary page. What I read in the next 3 lines completely destroyed any remaining excuse I had left for the boy I raised. The document was an independent cognitive capacity assessment, dated just 2 weeks before Evan moved Irene into the assisted living facility. According to the independent written capacity assessment prepared by the examining physician, my aunt had scored a perfect 30 out of 30 on her mental acuity exam. The doctor had written a clear, unequivocal statement confirming that Irene possessed full executive function, understood her financial assets perfectly, and was entirely capable of making her own legal decisions. She was not slipping. Her mind had not been failing at all. I closed my eyes, remembering the afternoon Evan stood in my living room 3 years ago. My son had looked deeply distressed, running his hands through his hair, and told the entire family that his great-aunt had forgotten her own address. He claimed she left the kitchen stove burning all night and nearly burned the historic house to the ground. Using our collective fear, he had quietly taken control of her checkbook, and he used this fabricated narrative of dementia to justify locking her away in a managed care facility. Evan had manufactured the entire crisis just to get Irene out of her own house, paving the way for Emily to turn the empty property into a sponsored renovation project. My jaw locked so tight my teeth ground together, sending a dull ache shooting up into my temples. The medical paper crinkled slightly under the intense pressure of my grip. I had spent days agonizing over whether Evan had simply made a foolish mistake, desperately hoping he was just in over his head with the mounting renovation costs. But this clinical evaluation proved his actions were cold, calculated, and entirely deliberate. He knew Irene was perfectly competent, and he chose to erase her independence anyway for the sake of a corporate brand deal. The phone screen lit up again, dragging my attention away from the doctor's signature. It was an automated notification from a social media platform, alerting me that Emily had just posted a brand new update. I tapped the screen out of a dark, morbid curiosity, and the video loaded instantly. My daughter-in-law was standing on the front porch of the Portland house, holding up a shiny brass key with a giant decorative ribbon tied around it. "Tomorrow night is the big moment," Emily announced, her smile wide and radiant against the evening sky. "We are hosting an exclusive live handover ceremony right here in the living room. Our media sponsors are flying in, the final contracts are ready to be signed, and we will officially transition this beautiful property into the headquarters for our new lifestyle company. I cannot wait to share this amazing new chapter with all of you." The video ended, freezing on her triumphant, glowing face. They really believed they had won. Evan and his wife thought they had successfully buried the truth under a mountain of sponsored content and aesthetic remodeling. They assumed I would just stay in the shadows, quietly paying the emotional and financial price for their ambition, just like I had done for 40 years. They expected me to fold. I did not yell, and I did not throw my coffee cup at the wall. The cold, heavy anger sitting in my chest burned away all the useless, lingering grief, leaving behind a sharp and absolute clarity. I stacked the hospital capacity assessment neatly on top of the original power of attorney and the certified property deed, aligning the paper edges perfectly. Sliding the entire stack back into the dark leather folder, I wrapped the string around the closure button and pulled it tight. The live ceremony was set for tomorrow evening. I had exactly 24 hours to get ready, and I certainly did not plan on missing the celebration. The bells attached to the heavy glass door of the diner jingled loudly, cutting through the steady hum of morning traffic on Burnside Street. I sat alone in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, wrapping both of my hands around a thick ceramic mug. The black coffee inside was scalding hot, but my fingers still felt completely numb. The smell of frying bacon and old grease hung heavily in the damp air, a deeply familiar scent from a place I used to bring my son every single Sunday morning 30 years ago. Outside the large window, a classic Portland drizzle had started to fall, blurring the streetlights into soft yellow streaks across the wet glass. I checked my watch. It was 7 in the morning on the day of the grand handover ceremony, and I had been sitting here for nearly an hour. The front door opened again, bringing a sudden gust of cold wind into the warm restaurant. Evan walked inside, scanning the room until his eyes found my booth. He wore a gray cashmere sweater and a heavy wool coat, looking impeccably dressed but incredibly exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw was set in a hard, defensive line as he slid into the seat across from me. "You left a voicemail saying it was an emergency," Evan said, keeping his voice low and tight. He did not bother taking off his coat, and he did not reach for the extra coffee cup the waitress had left on the table. "I have exactly 20 minutes, Dad. Emily is waiting for me at the property to meet the catering company." I looked closely at the boy I had raised, searching his face for any trace of guilt, hesitation, or regret. "I asked you to come here because I want you to tell me the truth. I want to hear it directly from you." "The truth about what?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "About the house," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. "And about Irene." Evan sighed heavily, running a hand through his carefully styled hair, and rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. "We have been over this a dozen times. Irene was losing her mind, and she was a danger to herself. She left the stove on all night. She forgot her own address, and I stepped up to manage her estate because someone in this family had to do it. Emily and I saved that house from rotting. Tell me the truth right now, and we can fix this quietly," I offered, leaning across the scratched Formica table. I kept my voice soft, offering him a genuine lifeline. "Call off the handover ceremony tonight. Cancel the corporate sponsorships, and tell Emily the property is not yours to sell. We can walk away, and nobody else has to know what you did." His jaw tightened, and a sharp, defensive edge crept into his words. "I am not canceling anything. We have a media deal worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table, and we are closing the contract tonight. You do not own the property," I stated clearly, watching his eyes narrow. "I have a power of attorney," Evan shot back, tapping his knuckles aggressively against the table. "Irene gave me full control when she started slipping. You know she did. If you try to ruin this for us out of some misplaced jealousy, I will have our lawyers bury you in paperwork." His cell phone buzzed loudly against the tabletop, lighting up with a picture of his wife. Emily was calling him. Evan snatched the device quickly, silencing the ring, but his entire posture shifted to a state of anxious urgency. He stared at the dark screen, terrified of disappointing the woman waiting for him, and far more terrified of losing his curated lifestyle than he was of lying to my face. "I am trying to protect you," I said softly, giving him one absolutely final chance. "I do not need your protection," Evan snapped, sliding out of the booth and standing up to his full height. He looked down at me with a mixture of pity and absolute arrogance. "You are just an old man who cannot stand watching his son succeed where he failed. Stay away from the house tonight. You are not on the guest list." He turned and walked out the glass door, disappearing into the gray morning rain. I sat there for a long time, listening to the sizzle of the grill in the kitchen. I had come here hoping my son would show a single shred of remorse, praying he would confess so I could spare him the public humiliation he was about to face. I never wanted to destroy his life. I only wanted the boy I raised to do the right thing, and he had chosen his path. 2 hours later, The sharp smell of fresh espresso and expensive leather greeted me as I walked into the downtown law office. David was waiting for me at his large mahogany desk, typing rapidly on his computer keyboard. The dark brown folder I had brought him yesterday rested on the corner of his desk, completely unpacked and organized into neat stacks. "Did you speak with him?" the attorney asked, pausing his typing to look up at me. "I did," I replied, taking the guest chair and resting my heavy hands on my knees. "He refused to stop the sale. He looked me right in the eye and told me he has full authority to sell the property." David nodded slowly, turning his monitor slightly so I could see the screen. "I drafted the Notice of Invalid Authority this morning. It explicitly outlines the strict limitations of his legal power, and it cites the independent medical assessment proving your aunt was entirely competent. Once I send this document to the escrow company and the title agency, the transaction is officially dead." "Is it ready to go?" I asked, my voice remaining steady despite the heavy, suffocating weight settling deep inside my chest. "The document is prepared, but it is not sent yet," David explained, pulling a printed copy from his laser printer and sliding it across the polished wood. "I need you to be absolutely certain before we proceed. Once I submit this filing, there is no taking it back. The media sponsors will pull their funding immediately. Emily will face a massive breach of contract, and your son will likely be investigated for fiduciary fraud. This will ruin them." I looked down at the crisp white paper, reading the bold legal header at the top of the page. These printed words represented the absolute end of my family as I knew it. A quiet, persistent voice in the back of my mind told me I could still walk away, let them steal the house, and retreat to my quiet, lonely life. But then I remembered Irene, sitting in that sterile, assisted living room, stripped of her dignity and her freedom, and I remembered my son looking me in the eye and lying without a single flinch. "Do you want me to send it?" David asked softly, his hand hovering patiently over his computer mouse. "Not without her direct permission," I told David, watching his hand hover patiently over the computer mouse. "Irene is the legal owner of that property, and she has to be the one to officially hire you. We are not doing this behind her back." The attorney nodded slowly, clearly understanding the necessity of an ironclad legal foundation. He printed a standard representation agreement, grabbed his worn leather briefcase, and followed me out to the parking garage. The drive to the assisted living center took exactly 20 minutes. Heavy afternoon rain washed over the windshield of my truck the entire way, the rhythmic thud of the wiper blades matching the anxious, sinking feeling in my gut. We were racing against a ticking clock, and the hours were slipping away far too quickly. Arriving at the care facility, we found my aunt sitting in the exact same wingback chair she had occupied yesterday. The room smelled faintly of bleached linens and institutional vegetable soup. Her yellow cardigan looked a little more faded in the gray afternoon light pouring through the window, but her posture remained perfectly straight. "Mrs. Walsh," the lawyer said, introducing himself with a polite, respectful nod. He pulled a vinyl visitor chair close to her knees and laid the printed contract onto her lap. "Your nephew explained the difficult situation regarding your house. If you sign this paper, I become your official legal representative. That gives me the authority to formally block the commercial transaction happening in your living room tonight." Irene did not hesitate for a single second. Her weathered hands reached for the gold pen David offered, gripping the smooth metal barrel with surprising strength. She pressed the tip to the paper and signed her full name on the bottom line, her cursive loops sharp and deliberate. Handing the pen back, the old woman looked directly into my eyes. The fierce determination in her gaze made her look 10 years younger. "Stop the sale, Raymond." "We will," I promised, taking the signed paper and handing it carefully to the lawyer. David wasted absolutely no time. He opened his laptop right there on the small laminate table next to her bed, connecting to the wireless network of the building. With a few rapid keystrokes, he attached the scanned copy of her fresh signature, the strict power of attorney, the recorded property deed, and his formal notice of invalid authority into a single, massive email file. He sent the entire legal package directly to the senior escrow officer and the title agency handling Emily and Evan's real estate deal. We sat in silence, waiting for any kind of response. The wall clock ticked loudly above the television set, counting down the hours until the evening handover ceremony. 10 minutes later, a sharp notification chimed from the computer speakers. David opened the reply, scanning the text quickly, before a deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. "They received the file," the attorney announced, turning the screen so I could see the official company letterhead. "And it turns out we are not the only ones asking questions today. The title officer replied that they had already flagged a minor discrepancy in the chain of ownership earlier this week. Evan told them it was just a clerical error and promised to provide a supplemental affidavit tonight before the final signatures. My son had known the paperwork was flawed, but he tried to bluff his way through the closing process anyway, assuming nobody would look too closely at the fine print. That arrogant, reckless gamble was about to cost him everything. Because we submitted formal contrary evidence, the escrow company has officially opened an emergency review, David continued, closing his laptop with a soft thud. The transaction is not completely frozen just yet, because their legal department has to verify our documents against the county records. But they absolutely cannot legally disperse any funds or transfer the title while a review is active. Everything is on hold. The legal barrier was finally in place. All we had to do now was wait for the trap to snap shut on live television. By 7 o'clock that evening, the Portland sky had turned a deep, bruised purple. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, staring intently at the glowing screen of my tablet. Emily had just started her live broadcast, and the viewer count climbed rapidly, hitting 50,000 people in less than 5 minutes. My daughter-in-law stood in the center of the restored living room, looking absolutely triumphant. She wore a tailored white dress, and her perfectly styled hair caught the bright illumination of the massive studio lights. The house looked magnificent behind her, completely packed with wealthy investors, corporate sponsors, and local media personalities holding crystal champagne glasses. Emily was completely unaware that an emergency legal review was actively tearing her entire brand apart behind the scenes. "Welcome, everyone," she said directly to the camera, her voice vibrating with carefully manufactured emotion. "Tonight is the beautiful culmination of years of sacrifice. Evan and I are about to sign the final contracts, officially partnering with our incredible sponsors to turn this historic family property into a beacon for modern lifestyle design." The camera panned smoothly to the right, revealing my son standing next to a small wooden podium. Evan wore the same expensive navy suit from yesterday, but he had swapped his tie for a crisp silver one. He smiled warmly at his wife, playing the role of the supportive, hard-working husband flawlessly. A representative from the media company stood right beside him, holding a sleek electronic tablet displaying the closing documents. My chest tightened painfully, and my breath caught in the back of my throat. I watched the screen intensely, waiting for the inevitable phone call from the escrow office to interrupt the celebration. The timing had to be precise, or Evan might actually manage to sign his name and drag the legal battle out in civil court for years. "Are you ready, darling?" Emily asked, gesturing gracefully toward the podium. The online chat box scrolled by in a chaotic blur of supportive comments and heart symbols. "I have never been more ready," Evan replied confidently, reaching out his hand to take the digital stylus from the corporate representative. He held the pen over the glowing screen, hovering just an inch above the signature line. The entire room went completely silent, holding its collective breath, waiting for the defining moment that would cement their fake legacy forever. I sat in the cold cab of my rusted pickup truck, parked exactly half a block away from the brilliantly lit property. Rain drummed a steady, relentless rhythm against the metal roof. The glowing screen of my tablet rested against the steering wheel, broadcasting the live feed from inside the house. My son held a digital stylus over a corporate tablet, hovering just an inch above the final signature line. Headlights washed across my rearview mirror as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb behind me. David stepped out into the Portland drizzle, holding his worn leather briefcase tightly against his chest to protect it from the weather. I pushed the heavy truck door open and stepped onto the wet pavement. Grabbing the dark brown folder from the passenger seat, I tucked the leather securely under my heavy canvas jacket and gave the attorney a single nod. We walked toward the house together in absolute silence. Through the tiny speaker of my tablet, Emily was still talking to her massive online audience. "Before Evan makes this partnership official, I want to present our incredible sponsors with a token of our deep appreciation," she announced. I could hear the rustle of a velvet box opening on the broadcast. This vintage brass key represents the foundation of our family legacy, unlocked and ready for a brand new era. My heavy work boots crunched over the wet gravel of the driveway. Bright white illumination spilled out from the tall living room windows, cutting through the dark, misty air of the neighborhood. The massive mahogany front door had been propped wide open to accommodate the catering staff, allowing the dull roar of 50 party guests to drift out onto the porch. I stepped into the grand foyer, leaving dark, muddy footprints across the pristine white marble flooring. David followed right behind me, his wet shoes squeaking slightly against the polished stone. In the center of the living room, Evan finally lowered his hand. Just as the plastic tip of his stylus touched the glowing glass screen of the corporate tablet, a sharp, obnoxious ringtone shattered the carefully curated silence of the ceremony. It was not my son ringing. The loud noise came from the suit jacket of the media company representative standing right beside him. The corporate closing representative frowned, interrupting the signing process as his phone vibrated. He glanced at the caller ID, and the color drained from his face. "Excuse me, I have to take this," the man whispered. Stepping away from the podium, he pressed the phone to his ear. "This is Miller." "Yes. From escrow?" "Wait, what do you mean the file is frozen?" Emily kept her perfect, radiant smile pinned in place for the camera, but her eyes darted nervously toward the sponsor. She opened her mouth to smooth over the awkward pause, likely preparing a charming joke about the unpredictability of live broadcasting, but the words never came out. I stepped out of the shadowy hallway and walked directly into the blinding glare of her towering ring lights. A collective gasp rippled through the crowded room. 50 wealthy investors, local influencers, and camera operators turned their heads to stare at the dripping, wet old man ruining their aesthetic background. The heavy scent of roasted garlic and floral arrangements caught in the back of my throat, bringing back the bitter memory of my humiliation in this exact room just 24 hours ago. All the color drained from Evan's face, leaving his skin looking like dirty chalk. His hand began to tremble, and the digital stylus clattered onto the wooden podium. The title agency just halted the entire transaction, the media representative announced, lowering his phone and staring at my son with pure hostility. They received a formal legal dispute regarding the ownership of this property. We cannot sign anything. Emily waved her manicured hands frantically toward the camera operator. The lifestyle influencer dropped her soft, inviting persona instantly, her voice dropping to a harsh, panicked hiss. "Turn the feed off right now. Cut the camera." "Do not turn it off on our account," David said clearly, stepping out from behind my shoulder and walking straight toward the podium. The seasoned attorney placed his wet leather briefcase onto a nearby coffee table. He popped the brass latches open, retrieved a thick stack of printed papers, and dropped them directly on top of the corporate tablet. The heavy thud of the documents slapping against the podium echoed loudly in the quiet room. "What is the meaning of this?" Emily demanded, stepping in front of her husband as if she could physically shield their lies from the glaring lights. She turned toward the bewildered sponsor, forcing a breathless, condescending laugh. "This is just a terrible misunderstanding. My father-in-law has been struggling lately, and he is very confused about the legal arrangements we made for his aunt." "I am not confused," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and steady, "and neither is Irene." David adjusted his silver reading glasses, looking completely unfazed by the hostile glaring of the crowd. He tapped the top page of the printed stack with a gold pen. "This is not a misunderstanding, Mrs. Cole," the lawyer stated with absolute, clinical precision. "These are physical copies of the certified recorded deed, proving Irene Walsh is the sole owner of this property. Beneath that is the original limited power of attorney, which contains a strict clause forbidding your husband from transferring any real estate to himself or his business entities. He had absolutely zero legal authority to negotiate this commercial deal." The online chat box on the broadcast monitor, which the frantic cameraman had still not managed to disconnect, exploded into a chaotic blur of scrolling text. Thousands of viewers were watching the beautiful, self-made family facade crumble into dust in real time. Evan stared at the papers, recognizing the thick blue notary seal stamped on the bottom page. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, desperately hoping I would somehow step in and save him from the fire he had started. I simply stared back, refusing to offer a single ounce of comfort. Emily crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her jaw locked in absolute fury. A piece of paper does not prove anything. Evan was acting in the best interest of a woman who can no longer make decisions for herself. When we take this to court, the judge will understand we were just trying to manage her care. "We can certainly take this to a judge," David agreed pleasantly, snapping his briefcase shut. He looked directly into the camera lens, fully aware of the massive audience hanging onto his every word. "We have the deed, and we have the formal notice of invalid authority. But if you would prefer to discuss what we found on the synchronized email accounts attached to Irene's old family tablet, we can absolutely do that right now, live on the internet." The room erupted into a wave of furious, overlapping whispers. Inside the living room, a deafening roar of overlapping voices erupted. 50 wealthy guests and local influencers began whispering frantically, their wide eyes darting between the printed documents on the podium and my son's terrified face. With a swift, angry motion, The corporate media representative snatched the stack of papers right out from under David's hand, completely ignoring Emily as she tried to block his reach. "You cannot look at those," my daughter-in-law hissed, her voice losing every ounce of its polished, camera-ready charm. Her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped the edge of the wooden stand. "Those are strictly private documents. This old man hacked into our personal accounts. Your husband left an authenticated email session open on a device legally owned by Irene Walsh. She voluntarily provided that device to counsel. We immediately preserved its contents and documented the chain of custody. Whether each message is ultimately admitted is for the court to decide, but the material is more than sufficient to support today's emergency title review. If litigation becomes necessary, these communications will provide a substantial basis for discovery." I watched the corporate sponsor flip to the third page of the printed stack. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin an unhealthy, sickly shade of pale. Silence fell over the room again, broken only by the heavy Portland rain drumming relentlessly against the tall glass windows. Reading from the highlighted text, the sponsor cleared his throat, holding the paper up to the harsh, blinding glare of the studio lights. "If we just delay the trust paperwork, we can use the property for the new lifestyle channel," the man read aloud, his deep voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Her memory is perfectly fine right now, but we can easily tell the family she is slipping. I will handle the paperwork and get the power of attorney signed." These words hung in the damp, garlic-scented air, heavy and absolute. Sent directly from Evan to Emily, the digital message was dated 3 years ago, written long before Irene ever set foot inside the assisted living facility. My chest tightened so hard, it became physically difficult to pull any air into my lungs. For weeks, I had desperately clung to the fragile, pathetic hope that Emily had manipulated my son into this elaborate scheme. I wanted to believe the boy I raised was just weak, blinded by his glamorous wife and her relentless ambition for internet fame. But hearing his own calculated words read aloud destroyed that final, foolish illusion. Evan had not been dragged into this fraud. He had drafted the blueprint himself, locking his own flesh and blood inside a sterile room just to steal a house. For the first time that night, Evan opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. Dropping the papers back onto the podium, the media representative acted as if the documents were physically burning his fingers. He looked at Emily, then turned his gaze toward Evan, his expression filled with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "We are completely done here," the sponsor announced clearly, stepping away from the glowing ring lights and pulling his phone from his pocket. He turned to his camera crew, waving a hand forcefully toward the front door. "Pack up all the equipment right now. We are pulling all funding effective immediately, and our legal team will be contacting you in the morning regarding the advance payments you already spent." Without even slowing down, the executive ignored Emily as she chased after him, her voice cracking as she begged for a private meeting in the hallway. Meanwhile, the remaining guests were already shuffling rapidly toward the foyer, grabbing their wet coats from the racks and carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone. The catering staff quietly backed into the kitchen, abandoning trays of expensive appetizers on the marble counter. The massive, beautiful empire my son had tried to build was collapsing into dust right in front of us, piece by piece. Standing completely frozen behind the wooden stand, Evan stared down at the scattered email printouts. His broad shoulders slumped forward, making him look exactly like a terrified little boy caught in a lie. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me across the empty space of the ruined living room. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of retreating footsteps and clicking camera cases. I did not answer him. There was absolutely nothing left to say, no debts left to pay, and no mistakes left to fix. My hands rested heavily at my sides, and the cold reality of his betrayal settled permanently into my bones. Breaking the heavy silence between us, David reached into his wet leather briefcase one more time. The lawyer pulled out a small black electronic drive and set it down gently next to the scattered emails on the podium. "There is actually one more piece of evidence we recovered from your aunt today," David said quietly, looking directly into my son's panicked eyes. "Irene knew you were lying to the family about her memory, and she wanted to make sure nobody could ever twist her words again. She left us an audio recording." David plugged the small black drive into the side of his silver laptop. A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the living room, quickly replacing the chaotic whispers of the fleeing party guests. Evan stared at the computer screen, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. My daughter-in-law crossed her arms tightly, her knuckles turning stark white, stubbornly refusing to look at the lawyer. The attorney pressed a button, and a familiar, raspy voice filled the grand space. My name is Irene Walsh, and today is October 4th. The audio was slightly muffled, likely recorded directly onto the tablet microphone, but the absolute authority in her tone remained unmistakable. I am making this recording because my nephew keeps asking me about the title to the house. I see the way he looks at the property, and I know exactly what that look means. My son flinched visibly, taking a half step backward. Hearing her voice echo off the mahogany walls felt like a ghost had just walked into the room, systematically stripping away every single lie he had carefully constructed. Let me be completely clear, Irene continued through the speakers, her words sharp and deliberate. Evan has my permission to pay the utility bills, and he can hire contractors to fix the leaking roof. He is acting strictly as a temporary caretaker. This young man does not own the land, he will never own the foundation, and he absolutely does not have my consent to sell it to a corporate sponsor. The recording clicked off, leaving nothing but the sound of the Portland rain hitting the tall glass windows. There was no legal loophole left to exploit. No brilliant public relations spin could possibly erase the undeniable proof of his calculated betrayal. Emily realized it first. Her carefully crafted, welcoming persona dissolved in an instant, replaced by a cold, furious glare. Uncrossing her arms, my daughter-in-law grabbed her designer handbag from the nearest armchair and walked straight toward the front door without saying a single word to her husband. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind her, rattling the brass fixtures and vibrating the floorboards. Evan was left standing completely alone next to the wooden podium. His gaze dropped to the polished floor, and he looked incredibly small inside his expensive navy suit. 3 days later, the atmosphere inside the downtown law office felt entirely different from the night of the ruined party. The chaotic, panicked energy had settled into a grim, bureaucratic reality. I sat in my usual leather chair, wrapping my hands around a paper cup of hot coffee, watching the gray morning clouds shift across the city skyline through the tall window. The heavy oak door opened, and my son walked into the room. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt, looking pale and thoroughly exhausted. Taking a seat on the far side of the massive wooden desk, Evan stared blankly at the mahogany surface. A junior attorney from a cheap local firm sat down beside him, looking completely out of his depth. David did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened a manila folder and slid a thick stack of printed documents across the desk. "This is the formal revocation of the power of attorney," David stated, tapping the top page with his gold pen. "Irene has officially terminated your legal authority, effective immediately. We are also presenting a comprehensive settlement agreement. If you sign this document today, you surrender any and all claims to the Portland property, and you agree to vacate the premises within 14 days. Evan stared at the papers, his jaw tight. "And if I refuse to sign?" "If you refuse, we will file a civil action for breach of fiduciary duty," the lawyer replied smoothly, resting his hands on the desk. "We will present the capacity assessment, the hidden emails, and Irene's own recording in open court. We fully expect the court to order your removal from the property, and that public litigation process will cost you far more than this settlement ever will." My son slowly turned his head, looking directly at me for the first time since he walked into the office. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles, silently begging for a final shred of parental mercy. For 40 years, I had always stepped in to soften his landing. Whenever he broke a window, wrecked a car, or missed a credit card payment, my checkbook was always ready to clean up the mess and shield him from the consequences. I met his gaze, holding it steady, and gave him absolutely nothing. The silence stretched tight across the room, heavy with unspoken finality. Realizing he was finally out of options, Evan picked up a plastic pen. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed the tip to the paper, signing his name on the bottom line. The scratching sound of the ink felt like a physical chain breaking loose from my chest. He flipped to the next page and signed the settlement agreement, officially surrendering the beautiful illusion he had stolen from a vulnerable old woman. Moving day arrived exactly 2 weeks later under a bright, cloudless sky. I parked my rusted pickup truck across the street from the house, rolling down the window to let the crisp autumn air inside the cab. A large white moving van sat parked in the driveway. Emily marched out the front door, carrying 2 heavy cardboard boxes of camera equipment. She wore plain gray sweatpants and dark sunglasses, her famous internet smile completely erased. The media sponsors had sued her for the advance payments, draining whatever money she had left in her personal accounts. Shoving the boxes into the back of her silver sedan, she slammed the trunk shut and drove away without looking back at the house she once called her forever home. A few minutes later, Evan walked out onto the porch. He carried a single canvas duffel bag over his shoulder. The custom Navy suits and expensive watches were gone, likely sold off to pay his junior attorney. Pausing on the top step, the boy I raised looked out at the street and noticed my truck parked by the curb. He stood there for a long moment, clutching the strap of his bag, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own choices. The distance between us was only 40 yards, but it felt like a vast, uncrossable ocean. I did not open the door, and I did not start the engine. I simply sat there, watching the dust settle over the empty driveway, fully aware that the hardest part was yet to come. Every action carries a permanent consequence, and the passing of time was about to show us exactly what those consequences looked like. The crisp autumn wind swept through the tall, ancient oak trees of Washington Park, scattering dry yellow leaves across the paved walking path. I sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench, holding my phone in my calloused hands for one final check before permanently deleting the social media application. The cold morning air carried the sharp, earthy scent of damp soil and roasted coffee from a nearby vendor cart, but my attention was completely focused on the small, glowing screen. My former daughter-in-law stood inside a cramped, dimly lit rental apartment. Emily was holding a scuffed designer handbag up to her camera, desperately trying to auction off the last remnants of her old wardrobe to a rapidly shrinking audience. The cheap beige carpet and peeling beige paint behind her looked a world away from the imported rugs and custom mahogany walls she used to claim as her own. "This piece has so much history," Emily said, her voice sounding thin and strained through the tiny phone speaker. She forced a bright, brittle smile that did not reach her eyes. "I am just clearing out some old energy, stepping into a new season of minimalist living." It was a pathetic, transparent lie. The corporate media sponsors had ruthlessly sued her for breach of contract immediately after the escrow company halted our property transaction. The ensuing legal battle drained every single bank account she possessed, forcing her to liquidate her entire curated life just to pay her defense attorneys. Her pristine public image had shattered overnight once the truth about the fraudulent handover ceremony leaked online. I locked the screen, letting the display fade to black, and slipped the device deep into the pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I felt absolutely no triumph watching her struggle. There was only a quiet, profound relief that the poisonous charade was finally over. The massive legal settlement had been signed and finalized nearly 1 year earlier, officially closing the darkest chapter of our family history. David made sure the paperwork was completely ironclad, permanently stripping Evan of his power of attorney and returning full control of the estate back to its rightful owner. The historic Portland house was sold to a lovely young couple a few months later, and the substantial profits were placed into a secure medical trust. I turned my head, looking down the path to where Irene sat in her specialized transport chair. She was wrapped in a thick, woven wool blanket, her face tilted up toward the pale morning sun, completely at peace. The independent living facility we found for her was incredibly kind, filled with bright windows and patient nurses, and she no longer had to worry about anyone stealing her independence. She looked over at me and offered a small, contented smile, looking more vibrant at 85 than she had in years. A loud, metallic clatter suddenly broke the peaceful silence of the park. Just 20 yards away, a maintenance worker had dropped a heavy steel pipe wrench onto the concrete sidewalk. The man was wearing a faded gray utility uniform, kneeling next to a broken irrigation pipe, with his hands covered in dark, wet mud. He cursed softly, wiping his forehead with the back of his dirty sleeve. And then he froze completely. Evan slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking directly onto mine. The boy I had spent 40 years protecting looked incredibly tired, his broad shoulders slumped under the heavy weight of his new reality. He had lost the custom Navy suits, the shiny luxury cars, and the glamorous marriage he had burned his soul to keep. My son was now working grueling manual labor shifts just to afford a basic apartment across town, living the exact kind of difficult blue-collar life he had always thought he was too good for. The settlement agreement had left him with absolutely nothing except the consequences of his own greed. For a long, tense moment, neither of us moved. The wind rushed through the branches overhead, filling the space between us with a low, mournful, rushing sound. Evan slowly stood up from the wet concrete, wiping his muddy hands furiously on his gray trousers. His throat worked as he swallowed hard, and he took a hesitant half-step forward, opening his mouth as if he wanted to speak. His eyes were wide and vulnerable, silently begging for the familiar safety net I had always provided. He wanted me to stand up, cross the distance, and tell him everything was going to be all right. He desperately wanted his father to step in and fix his broken life. I sat firmly on the wooden bench, resting my hands squarely on my knees, and I did not bridge the gap. The heavy, suffocating instinct to rescue him flared up in my chest one last time, an old habit deeply ingrained in my bones. But I looked at Irene sitting peacefully in the sun, and I looked at the muddy, exhausted man standing on the sidewalk, finally understanding the true cost of my endless bailouts. Rescuing him again would only teach him how to build a brand new lie. I had spent my entire adult life shielding him from pain, and that relentless protection had almost destroyed an innocent woman. I met my son's desperate gaze and offered him a single, polite nod, acknowledging him as a grown man rather than a helpless child. I did not glare, and I did not gloat. Then, without a single word of anger or accusation, I stood up from the wooden bench. I turned my back on him, walking down the paved path to take my aunt back home. You may still be my son, but you are no longer my responsibility. When you hold your child for the very first time, an invisible contract is written into your bones. You promise to keep them safe from the fire. You swear you will stand between them and the sharp, unforgiving edges of the world. For decades, you honor that silent agreement. You pay off the quiet debts, you fix the careless mistakes, and you smooth out the rough roads they insist on walking down. You do this because society tells you that a good parent is a relentless shield, a constant source of unconditional rescue. But eventually, you have to face a terrifying reality. If you spend your entire life absorbing the consequences of their choices, you are not actually raising a responsible adult. You are simply building a highly functioning illusion. There is a profound, devastating difference between supporting a child and enabling their destruction. It is incredibly easy to confuse the two, especially when the person asking for a bailout is someone you love more than your own life. You write the check or make the excuse because it feels easier than watching them struggle. You convince yourself that this one last time will definitely be the turning point. However, true love, the kind of love that actually heals and shapes character, requires absolute honesty. It requires the immense, heartbreaking courage to close your checkbook, lock your front door, and step completely out of the way. Setting a firm financial and emotional boundary with a grown child feels like tearing out your own heart. It goes directly against every natural biological instinct you possess as a caregiver. When you finally stop answering those frantic late-night phone calls, the silence that follows will be incredibly heavy and thick with anxiety. You will likely sit alone in the dark, wrestling with a deep sense of guilt, wondering if you made the right decision. Yet, that painful, lonely distance is the exact environment where real growth finally takes root. A person cannot learn how to walk on their own 2 feet if you are constantly carrying them across the finish line. They have to feel the cold, hard pavement. They must be allowed to understand the true, heavy cost of their own greed, their own unchecked pride, and their own deceit. You are never required to be a permanent shock absorber for someone else's bad decisions. Your hard-earned retirement savings, your mental peace, and your personal dignity are not bargaining chips to be endlessly sacrificed to fund their manufactured lifestyle. You have a fundamental right to say no, and you absolutely do not owe anyone an apology for protecting your own future. Letting go does not mean you have stopped loving your family. It simply means you have finally accepted that their life is their own to ruin, and more importantly, their own to rebuild from the ground up. Have you ever had to draw a hard, painful line in the sand with someone you loved in order to save your own sanity? How did you find the inner strength to finally step back and let them face the reality of their own consequences? Please, share your story in the comments below, because someone else reading this right now might desperately need the exact courage you finally found.